Disrespect has a price. He spit in my face, so I sold his mansion to a junkyard. The flickering lights of the city outside seemed to mock the tension brewing inside. This was not a sudden act of rebellion. It was a calculated strike, months in the making. The air conditioning hummed softly, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the heavy silence that followed his despicable act. My son, Brandon, looked me dead in the eye across the crisp white tablecloth of a five-star restaurant and spit in my face. He didn't yell or throw a tantrum. He deliberately gathered the saliva, leaned forward with pure contempt, and launched it at the man who taught him to walk. The scars on my knuckles tell stories of 1,000 bricks laid in the freezing rain, of scaffolding erected in the biting wind. The dust in my lungs is a permanent reminder of the empire I built from nothing. I didn't inherit wealth. I carved it out of the frozen ground with my bare hands. Every steel beam in this city bears the invisible mark of my sweat. But to them, I was an embarrassment, an archaic relic of a forgotten era, a man who didn't know the difference between a Pinot Noir and a Cabernet. I didn't wipe it off. I let it sit on my left cheek as the upscale dining room went silent. I let it dry as a reminder. That was the moment my son died to me, becoming nothing more than a toxic asset I had to liquidate. I stood up without a word, walked out, and made a phone call that would turn his million-dollar life into rubble. The lighting was deliberately dim, casting long, deceiving shadows that masked the true cost of the evening. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted marrow, a cloying combination that made my stomach churn. The clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of pretentious conversations created a symphony of arrogance. Waiters moved with practiced elegance, their eyes scanning the room for signs of wealth and status, dismissing those who lacked the proper attire. It was a place designed to make men like me feel small, but I had built skyscrapers. I knew how to stand tall. Before I tell you how I dismantled his world in less than 24 hours, let me introduce myself. My name is Clint. I'm 70. I spent 40 years with calloused hands and concrete dust in my lungs, building Chicago's skyline. Starting as a bricklayer mixing mortar in freezing rain, I eventually owned the construction firm that built the luxury estate my son lives in. I built a legacy of steel and stone, but to Brandon and his entitled wife Vanessa, I was just a walking checkbook in a cheap suit. I sat alone for 15 minutes, watching the elite sip their overpriced drinks, feeling the weight of their judgmental stares. When they finally arrived, they moved like royalty holding court. Brandon's suit hugged his shoulders perfectly, a tailor's masterpiece designed to hide the frailness of his character. Vanessa's jewelry caught the ambient light, sparkling with a ferocity that matched her ambition. Her heels clicked sharply against the imported hardwood floor, demanding the attention of every soul in the room. They didn't walk. They paraded, oblivious to the ridiculousness of their own vanity. The night it happened was supposed to be a celebration, their 10th anniversary. Brandon insisted on the Gilded Fork, a pretentious downtown restaurant where a glass of water costs more than my old hourly wage. Waiters there looked down on anyone without a Rolex. I arrived early in my charcoal suit, bought in 1995 for my late wife's funeral. Kept clean in plastic, it represented respect to me, though to Vanessa, it represented a smell she couldn't stand. They arrived 20 minutes late without apology, sweeping in like royalty. Brandon wore a bespoke suit, Vanessa dripping in gold jewelry they couldn't afford on his salary. The joints in my fingers ached with the familiar pain of a lifetime of hard labor. These hands had built the very walls that sheltered them, mixed the mortar that held their lives together. I remembered the days I couldn't afford a hot meal, saving every penny so Brandon could have the latest toys, the best education. The contrast between my sacrifices and her disdain was a bitter pill, swallowed dry. She looked at me not as a father-in-law, but as a stubborn stain on her otherwise immaculate life. She air-kissed my cheek and wrinkled her nose. "Oh, Clint," she said in her syrupy, cruel voice. "You wore that old thing again. It smells like mothballs. We're near the Techstar CEO. Try not to draw attention." I said nothing. My rough, scarred hands, the hands that paid for her nose job, and his MBA rested on the table. She looked at them in disgust, then kicked Brandon's shin under the table. He grabbed my menu. "Here, Dad, let me order," Brandon said loudly. "You get confused by fancy menus and the font is too small." "I am not confused," I said quietly. I read fine. He ignored me, ordered a $400 vintage wine, and a Wagyu beef tasting menu for them. For me, he told the waiter, bring him chicken soup and soft bread. He has trouble chewing steak, digestion issues with the elderly. The sommelier had bowed slightly, offering recommendations that cost more than a reliable used car. Brandon waved him off with a flick of his wrist, playing the part of a seasoned connoisseur. The Wagyu beef was described with adjectives usually reserved for poetry, a decadent display of unnecessary extravagance. The chicken soup he ordered for me was a deliberate insult, a soft, bland meal meant to highlight my supposed frailty. It arrived in a plain white bowl, a stark contrast to their intricate culinary masterpieces. The broth was lukewarm, tasteless, a culinary reflection of their affection for me. The waiter pitied me. I had no digestion issues. I ate steak weekly, but they were painting me as a frail, senile old man needing their control. I sat in silence as they drank and laughed loudly, ignoring me completely to discuss their Aspen ski trip and a new Porsche lease. Vanessa checked nervously to see if the elite were watching, tensing every time I reached for my water. Finally, she turned to me. Clint, we need to do something about your living situation. That in-law suite out back is cluttered. You hoard. The clinking of silverware against fine china seemed unnaturally loud. Every sip of water I took was scrutinized, every movement monitored. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room, paranoid that someone might witness her associating with the lower class. Her shoulders were tense, her posture rigid, a physical manifestation of her shallow insecurities. The conversation at their end of the table was a rapid-fire exchange of brand names and exotic destinations, a desperate attempt to validate their existence through material wealth. I do not hoard, I replied flatly. Those are my tools and blueprints, my life's work. It's junk, she snapped. Brandon, and I think it's time you look at assisted living facilities. I gripped my napkin. I was cleaner in body and spirit than both of them, mostly because my conscience was clean. Let's not talk about this right now, Brandon intervened, but he shot her a look that meant, stick to the script. We aren't there yet. The fabric of the napkin was thick, heavily starched, and rough against my palms. I felt a surge of pride in my calloused skin, a badge of honor they could never understand. I remembered the early mornings, the smell of fresh lumber, the satisfaction of a day's hard work. My conscience was clean, untainted by the greed and superficiality that consumed them. I built my life on a foundation of integrity. They built theirs on a quicksand of debt and deception. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. When the food arrived, my soup was lukewarm. Their plates were culinary art. I watched them intently. After 40 years in construction, I know what a structural crack looks like. My son was cracking. He gulped wine, forced his laughs, sweated in the freezing AC, and checked his phone constantly. I recognized the signs of a desperate man in over his head. After dessert, Brandon pulled a thick blue folder from his briefcase, wearing a serious business face that made him look like a boy playing dress-up. Dad, we need to talk business, he said. You could hear it in the way he spoke, a frantic energy that belied his calm facade. The wine didn't relax him, it only fueled his manic desperation. He was a man drowning, grasping at any lifeline he could find, even if it meant pulling his own father under. The subtle tremors in his hands, the way he constantly checked his reflection in the silverware, all pointed to a structural failure. The foundation of his life was crumbling, and he was trying to patch it with stolen money. I thought this was your anniversary dinner, I said. It is, but this is important. My company needs liquidity for growth. I'm worried about your assets rotting against inflation in low-yield bonds. What is this? I asked, looking at the folder. A transfer of management agreement, he said smoothly, sliding a gold pen over. It appoints me primary trustee. I'll modernize your investments, handle the heavy lifting, and you'll still get a stipend. You should be resting. I opened it. It wasn't a management agreement. It was an irrevocable power of attorney and total transfer of assets. It would give him absolute control over the $2 million I had saved, the deed to the land, and the right to sell everything. Vanessa was practically vibrating, hungry for my signature. I closed the folder with a snap. No, this single document represented the tragic culmination of his massive greed, perfectly showcasing his absolute failure as a truly honorable, decent man. The heavy, Unbearable silence between us stretched out endlessly, suffocating the small remaining fragments of our shared past, leaving absolutely nothing but the cold, harsh reality of his ultimate, undeniable betrayal here tonight. "What do you mean, no?" Brandon blinked. "I am not signing this, Dad. You aren't listening," Vanessa hissed. "You can't manage this wealth anymore. You forgot your car keys last week, the first sign of dementia." "I forgot them because you moved them," I said calmly. "And I know you aren't expanding your business, Brandon. You lost the city contract, your leverage to the hilt on the house I built for you." Brandon went white. "How do you know that?" "I built half this city. People talk. You're broke, drowning in debt to impress people who don't care about you. Now you want my retirement money to plug your sinking ship." "You are selfish," Brandon shouted, heads turning. "That money is sitting in a vault while I try to build a legacy." "Your legacy is a lie," I replied, voice heavy. "I built mine with sweat and blood. You're building a debt prison. I won't let you throw my life's work into the furnace of your vanity." Brandon shot up, chair scraping loudly, shaking with pure hatred. "You think you're a god because you laid bricks. You are nothing, a guest in my house living off my charity." "It is not your house," I said evenly. "I paid for the material and labor. The deed is in my name. It is mine." He screamed, shaking off Vanessa, smelling of sour wine. He got in my face. "Sign the papers right now, or I will throw you out tonight and put you in the worst state-run nursing home to rot in your own filth." I looked him dead in the eye and didn't blink. "No." That was when he gathered his saliva and spit. The wet glob of white foam hit my left cheek. The restaurant went dead silent. The CEO nearby dropped his fork. Vanessa gasped, but didn't apologize. A cruel smirk crept across her face. "Wipe it off, Dad," she said coldly, "and sign the damn papers." I sat still for 5 agonizing seconds, feeling the heat of the spit. My history with him flashed, teaching him to ride a bike, buying his first suit, paying for his wedding. Then I saw him as he was. A parasite, an enemy. I didn't wipe my face. I wanted the humiliation to burn so deeply I'd never have a moment of weakness again. I stood up at 6'2", with the broad chest of a man who carried concrete. I towered over him. Brandon stepped back, terrified, expecting a righteous punch. But I gave him nothing. I looked down, my expression void. "You say it's your house? You say I'm a guest?" I picked up the folder. "Okay, Brandon, you win. It is your house." I dropped it with a thud. "Enjoy it while you can." I walked away. Vanessa called after me in panic, but I didn't look back. I stepped into the biting Chicago night, the wind freezing, the spit on my face. I walked 3 blocks to a convenience store, bought a prepaid burner phone with cash to avoid GPS tracking, and called a number I hadn't dialed in 10 years. "Mr. Solomon," I said. "Clint. It's 2 in the morning. I know I need you to open the Redwood file." Silence. "Are you sure?" "That's the nuclear option. It will destroy him." I touched my dry cheek. "Pull it. Initiate the eviction. Sell the company, the land, the debt. I want him thrown on the street by Friday." I hung up, standing under a street lamp. At 70, I had declared war on my own flesh and blood. For the first time in 10 years, I felt alive. They thought I was a helpless old man they could rob. They forgot I am the man who pours the concrete and buries the steel. And tomorrow, I would bury them. It was 3 a.m. when I reached the wrought iron gates of the estate, gates I had welded myself 10 years ago. I punched my code into the keypad. Access denied. I tried again, denied. He hadn't just humiliated me. He had erased my access before dessert was served. I walked the perimeter. The wall was 8 feet high with iron spikes. My joints ached, but I built this wall and knew its weaknesses. Finding a recessed mortar joint, I jammed my shoe in, hauled myself over, and dropped into the azalea bushes. Avoiding the motion sensors I'd installed, I reached the carriage house. They called it an in-law suite, but it was a garage with a bed, where they'd shoved me after I sold my home to fund his startup. My key didn't work. The locks were new. The anniversary dinner was a distraction while a locksmith drilled out my life. I shimmied a side window open with a credit card and climbed in. The air inside hit me. It was colder than outside. I flipped the switch. Darkness. The faucet gave a hollow rattle. The radiator was stone cold. I checked the breaker panel. The main feed was physically disconnected from the outside box. They hadn't just locked me out. They had cut power, water, and heat in late October. It was attempted murder by hypothermia, designed to make me crawl to them and sign the papers for warmth. I sat on my narrow bed in the dark, breath fogging. This freezing box was my life now. I thought of the little boy who used to cry over scraped knees, for whom I worked double shifts in blizzards so he'd never be cold. Now he maliciously cut my heat. I realized my shivering wasn't from the cold, but from a pure, hot rage. I wasn't going to sleep here and give them the satisfaction of finding me frozen. I dropped to the floorboards and found a loose plank under the rug, a secret safe I built into every house. I pulled out a heavy metal lockbox wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were the original deeds, trust documents, loan ledgers, and the master key to the LLC that owned the estate. My insurance policy. I tucked the box under my arm, leaving everything else exactly as it was. I wanted them to find a freezing, empty room and panic. I climbed out the window into the night. They thought they trapped me in the dark, forgetting I wired the lights. When I turned them back on, it would be blinding. Before leaving, I needed their timeline. I crept to the main house. The library lights were on. I crouched by the double-paned window I'd installed. Vanessa's shrill voice cut through. She paced furiously on her phone. "No, you don't understand. He's highly aggressive. He spit on my husband. We need the secure unit. We need him locked down." I closed my eyes. She was crafting a false narrative to justify a psych ward, painting me as a violent monster so she could steal my wealth. "The price?" she asked. "What's the cheapest option?" "A shared ward is fine. Make sure it's secure tomorrow morning?" 8 a.m. Perfect. Bring heavy restraints and a strong sedative. Get him out before the neighbors see. She was haggling over my life, bargain bin disposal. 8 a.m. I checked my watch. 4 hours. 4 hours before state orderlies dragged me out in zip ties to die medicated in a sterile room. I peeked through the curtains. Brandon slumped in my leather armchair, clutching whiskey, looking sick. But he let her make the call, avoiding reality. I had heard enough. I had the timeline, the intent, and a burning fire in my belly. They wanted a helpless victim. I would give them a phantom. By the time they realized I was gone, the demolition of their perfect life would have begun. I climbed back over the wall, marching toward the city lights. I was no longer the burden. I was the impending reckoning. By sunset tomorrow, the estate would belong to the devastating consequences of their greed. I walked 3 miles to a gritty 24-hour diner, ordering black coffee in a corner booth. I unwrapped the metal box. Inside were the blueprints of my revenge. First, the land trust agreement. Brandon never read the fine print, designating me sole holder of the power of direction. He was just a glorified squatter. Next, the operating agreement for Redwood Holdings LLC, showing me as sole manager. Finally, the heavy steel corporate seal. At 4:15 a.m. I called Solomon again. "I have the papers," I said. "I am invoking Article 7, Section 3. That's the scorched earth clause," Solomon said. "It strips all rights and reverts everything to you. You said you'd only use it for gross misconduct or criminal activity." Is spitting in my face, cutting my heat in freezing weather, and conspiring to commit me to a psych ward gross misconduct? I asked. Silence. Then his voice turned surgical. "Start talking, Clint." I told him everything factually. When I finished, he exhaled. "We have grounds for a domestic war crime. Filing the revocation and eviction will freeze his accounts and the house locks. He'll have zero access, do it," I said. "And sell the land, cash buyer, quick close, gone by noon." "Waste management companies buy that fast," Solomon said. "To put a dump where a mansion is. Perfect. Sell it to the garbage men. I need the corporate seal." He said, "Meet me at my office at 6. Once we do this, he's a hostile defendant, not your son." He stopped being my son when he wiped his mouth and walked away. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the heavy, immovable weight of an anvil dropping onto frozen earth. "See you at 6. I clicked the heavy brass seal shut. The metallic sound echoed in the cramped, dimly lit diner. It sounded exactly like the unforgiving clang of a maximum security prison door locking shut forever. I lifted the chipped ceramic mug to my lips and drank the last dregs of my bitter, lukewarm coffee. It tasted like ash and regret, fitting for the morning I was having. I carefully wrapped the metal lockbox in a thick canvas bag, slung it over my broad shoulder, and walked out into the pre-dawn gray. The bitter Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons, slicing through my thin, worn coat like a barrage of icy razors, but I barely registered the freezing temperature. The fire burning deep inside my chest was entirely enough to keep me warm. I knew exactly what would happen at the sprawling estate at precisely 8 a.m. The heavy white medical van, unmarked but unmistakable in its grim purpose, would arrive at the wrought iron gates. Burly orderlies with heavy restraints and thick leather belts would march across the frost-covered grass, their heavy boots crunching loudly in the deafening morning silence. Brandon would be watching them from the warmth of the luxurious kitchen, cradling a steaming mug of expensive artisan coffee in his soft, uncalloused hands, a smug, satisfied smirk playing across his perfectly moisturized face. He would think he had finally won. They would try to use his master key on my bedroom door, but it wouldn't turn. It wouldn't work, because I had meticulously jammed the intricate internal mechanism from the inside, using hardened steel pins and epoxy. They would eventually lose patience and kick the heavy oak door in, fully expecting to find a violent, screaming madman thrashing against the walls, lost in the chaotic depths of severe dementia. They have to leave immediately. It was a forwarded text message from Brandon. Dad, please pick up the phone right now. We are incredibly worried about you. The local police are actively looking for you everywhere. They are currently filing a missing person report with the local authorities, I said flatly, turning the glowing screen around to show Solomon. I will personally call the precinct captain right now. I will explicitly tell him you are currently sitting comfortably in my office, legally liquidating millions of dollars in real estate assets, and that you are perfectly safe, Solomon said, waving his hand dismissively. He then reached into his desk drawer and slowly opened a thick, black leather folder. The atmosphere in the room grew noticeably colder. We ran a highly sophisticated deep background check on your son, Clint. It is significantly worse than we initially thought. He is not just completely broke. He recklessly borrowed $500,000 in illicit street cash from the Russo family. Loan sharks, vicious, unforgiving, murderous loan sharks. My supposedly brilliant visionary son had arrogantly bypassed the banks and gone straight to deeply entrenched, violent organized criminals to secretly fund his lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. He is currently 3 full months behind on his staggering payments, Solomon continued, his voice grim and serious. He desperately told them he had an incredibly wealthy father who was rapidly dying of natural causes, and he foolishly put the entire estate up as absolute collateral. I let out a harsh barking laugh that held absolutely zero humor. He arrogantly put up a magnificent house he does not legally own as collateral for a massive, illegal loan he cannot possibly hope to pay back. The horrifying reality of the situation slowly set in. My deeply foolish son had recklessly chosen to play an incredibly lethal, high-stakes game. By abruptly pulling the financial rug out from under him, I was not just taking away his beautiful house and his fancy cars. I was directly exposing him to a pack of starving, bloodthirsty wolves. And yet, looking deep within my own soul, I didn't feel a single ounce of paternal pity. I didn't feel the urge to swoop in and save him. The hot, wet spit on my cheek was a physical, unforgivable boundary he had violently crossed, permanently burning away the very last lingering shreds of my deeply ingrained fatherly instincts. File the papers, Solomon. File all of them, immediately. By noon, the massive electronic bank transfers were completely finalized. The various checking and savings accounts were completely frozen, the digital funds locked away behind impenetrable cryptographic walls. The expensive electronic smart locks on the sprawling estate were remotely deactivated, wiped clean, and heavily reprogrammed by the elite private security company under my explicit, unwavering new orders. I sat silently in Solomon's quiet, temperature-controlled office, looking out the massive plate glass window over the freezing, steel-gray waters of Lake Michigan. I had painstakingly spent 40 grueling years slowly building a massive, towering legacy from the muddy ground up, sacrificing my blood, sweat, and youth, only to ultimately realize I had unwittingly built a heavily fortified luxury fortress for ungrateful, narcissistic tyrants. Today I decisively swung the heavy iron wrecking ball. The utter demolition of his fraudulent life had officially begun, and I was going to sit back and watch every single beautifully crafted brick violently fall to the earth. The absolute end of my arrogant son's pathetic, unearned reign was finally here. It did not arrive with a loud, dramatic bang, but rather with the quiet, methodical scratching of a fountain pen and the heavy, metallic clack of a brass corporate seal. He genuinely thought he could easily discard me like useless, expired trash. Now, he was about to brutally learn what it truly meant to be permanently thrown away. When we legally sell this valuable land today, Clint, when we officially publicize the formal transfer of property ownership in the county records, those incredibly violent men will instantly find out their supposed collateral just evaporated into thin air. They are absolutely going to come directly for him, and they will not be polite about it. I stared blankly out the window at the cold, unforgiving, gray lake, watching the distant cargo ships slowly cut through the icy water. I genuinely felt a brief, microscopic flicker of ancient paternal instinct, the deeply ingrained biological urge to physically protect my offspring, to magically fix his monumental mistakes, to shield him from the terrible consequences of his own stupidity. But then, as if summoned by the universe, I vividly felt the sickening, phantom sensation of his warm, wet spit slowly sliding down my weathered cheek. The flicker of mercy instantly died, replaced by a cold, black void. "Let them come for him," I said, my voice as hard and cold as a tombstone. "Clint, I need you to fully understand the gravity of this. These are incredibly dangerous, ruthless men," Solomon warned softly, leaning forward. "I know exactly who they are, Solomon. I personally dealt with their fathers and uncles, back in the violent, blood-soaked 80s. I know their methods, so you are truly going to let your only son fall." I stood up slowly and methodically smoothed the sharp lapels of my expensive new suit, adjusting my silk tie. "I am absolutely not letting him fall, Solomon. I am simply and deliberately refusing to catch him. File the legal papers, sell the prime land, call the county sheriff. I am unfortunately not done yet," Solomon said, letting out a heavy sigh and slowly opening a second, thicker manila file. "You need to completely understand that this catastrophic situation is not just about bad spending habits or arrogant financial mismanagement. Your son is actively running a massive, illegal sieve." He slowly spread out a mountain of highlighted bank statements, international wire transfer receipts, and heavily redacted tax returns across the polished glass. "Look very closely at these specific incoming wire transfers for his supposedly legitimate consulting firm. $10,000 here, $15,000 there. They are all originating from heavily disguised, completely untraceable offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Within 24 hours of receiving the funds, the exact same amount of money magically goes right back out to a company called R&R Logistics. Russo and Russo." I stared intensely at the dizzying columns of printed numbers, the horrifying realization dawning on me. He is actively laundering illicit money for the Italian mob. Yes, he is. He greedily takes a small 2% cut of the clean money. That tiny percentage is exactly how he pays the exorbitant monthly lease on the flashy Porsche. But he is incredibly arrogant and remarkably sloppy. The federal IRS criminal division would have easily flagged this obvious pattern in 6 months anyway. He was absolutely going to a high-security federal prison regardless. We are just aggressively accelerating the inevitable timeline. A deep, freezing coldness rapidly spread through my chest, chilling my bones. My foolish son had literally sold his eternal soul just to briefly play the role of a powerful gangster. "There is even more," Solomon said quietly, sliding several glossy, high-resolution surveillance photos across the desk. The very first photo vividly showed Vanessa, looking stunning in a bright red designer dress that I had personally paid for, standing casually outside a very expensive downtown Chicago luxury hotel. She was passionately, deeply kissing Sterling, the incredibly wealthy, ruthless real estate developer who had recently outbid Brandon for the massive riverfront construction contract, the one specific man Brandon despised more than anyone else on earth. Our private investigator successfully intercepted her supposedly secure text messages, Solomon said, handing me a freshly printed transcript. "Vanessa, the pathetic old man is still breathing, unfortunately. It is taking way too long. Brandon is completely useless and weak. As soon as the final property transfer goes through and the money is safe, I am immediately filing for divorce. I will ruthlessly take my legal half, and we can finally go away to Italy. Sterling, just keep him calm and docile, baby. Do whatever it takes to get the final signature on the dotted line." Once the massive funds clear the bank, we will completely leave both of those pathetic losers in the dust. She was actively, maliciously playing him. She was deliberately using his blind arrogance to systematically steal my hard-earned money before planning to leave him entirely defenseless to the ravenous wolves. She absolutely knew about the massive, dangerous mob debt, and she simply didn't care if he lived or died. She is planning on leaving him the exact second she confidently thinks the money is absolutely secure, I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the raging inferno of anger building inside me. Yes, precisely. She already has a highly secretive hidden offshore account and has been quietly siphoning large sums of cash from the bloated household expenses for over a year. She literally has an emergency go-bag fully packed in the trunk of her Mercedes right now. She is a cold-blooded, calculating parasite actively looking for a much wealthier, stronger new host. I looked down at the damning photo of my son's incredibly treacherous, cheating wife and the thick stack of bank statements detailing his filthy blood money. Any tiny, lingering shred of mercy I might have still harbored was instantly and permanently extinguished, crushed into fine, invisible dust. Do it, I said, my voice completely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. Sell absolutely everything. Call the specific commercial bank that currently holds the massive underlying note on Brandon's struggling construction company. Tell the senior vice president that I am immediately withdrawing my personal, ironclad financial guarantee. Call the entire loan due immediately. Solomon's dark eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. Clint, doing that will instantly, irreversibly bankrupt the entire business. All of his corporate and personal assets will be completely frozen by the federal government before noon today. Good, exactly as planned. Then, I want you to send complete unredacted copies of these exact bank statements anonymously to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Clint, you need to understand that is guaranteed federal prison time. We are talking about 5 to 10 hard years behind bars. Federal prison has incredibly strong, impenetrable walls, Solomon. I am actually saving his pathetic life. I am deliberately putting him inside a locked steel cage, so the violent street sharks cannot literally eat him alive on the pavement. And what about Vanessa? Solomon asked, arching an eyebrow. Send these high-resolution photos and the complete text message transcripts directly to Brandon's personal phone via an untraceable number right after the county sheriff serves the final eviction notice. When he finally hits absolute, terrifying rock bottom today, I want him to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he is entirely, completely alone in this world. Solomon slowly exhaled a long, deep breath. This is truly biblical, Clint. This is scorched earth. No, Solomon, it is simply business. I am ruthlessly liquidating a completely failed, catastrophic investment. At precisely 11 o'clock, the heavy oak doors to the conference room swung open, and the sterile, filtered air of the law firm instantly shifted, replaced by the heavy, pungent, unmistakable weight of industrial diesel fuel and cheap aftershave. Slater, the aggressive regional director for Tri-State Waste Management, walked confidently into the room. Built exactly like a muscular, aggressive bulldog, he didn't even bother to offer any fake, polite pleasantries. Solomon quickly buttoned his expensive suit jacket. Mr. Slater, thank you very much for coming on such incredibly short notice. Slater simply grunted loudly, aggressively shaking Solomon's hand before turning his sharp gaze to me. His rough, incredibly calloused grip silently acknowledged the identical, hard-earned calluses on my own massive hands. Mr. Vance, I clearly understand we have a very unique, highly time-sensitive situation here. Immediate physical possession of the property. Immediate, unrestricted industrial demolition. Straight cash. That is exactly correct, I said, meeting his intense stare without blinking. I want the entire magnificent structure completely leveled to the dirt, and I want your heavy dump trucks actively rolling onto the property by tomorrow morning. Slater smiled, reaching into his worn leather jacket, and pulled out a certified stamped cashier's check. $2.2 million. It was significantly more actual money than my arrogant son had ever legitimately earned in his entire miserable life. It was the exact calculated price of his breathtaking arrogance and cruelty. We have been aggressively trying to get a solid commercial foothold in that specific, Highly restricted zoning district for over 5 long years, Slater grinned wolfishly, revealing a chipped tooth. The local city council and all the wealthy, snobby neighbors fought us tooth and nail every single step of the way. But since you still legally own the original underlying mineral rights and the crucial industrial variances from the original 1980 property deed, we are legally going to put a massive, noisy, incredibly smelly waste transfer station exactly right where your beautiful, pristine rose garden currently sits. The wealthy neighbors are going to absolutely hate it. It will ruin their property values. I do not care about the neighbors, I replied coldly, my voice completely flat. They all stood by and quietly watched my son treat me like a rabid, unwanted dog for years, and they said absolutely nothing. Let them smell the rotting trash. Solomon silently slid the original, yellowed 1980 property deed across the polished table. It represented 40 long, agonizing years of backbreaking sweat, endless, grueling overtime, and a massive college fund I never once spent on myself. I slowly picked up the heavy, incredibly expensive Mont Blanc fountain pen. For one brief, agonizing second, I suddenly thought about the joyous Christmas mornings in that massive house, the roaring fireplace, and the small, faded pencil marks on the doorframe marking Brandon's rapid growth over the years. By signing this document, I was literally signing away the very last piece of physical evidence that we were ever a real, loving family. But then, as quickly as the memory came, I sharply remembered the freezing, broken radiator in my tiny room, the newly drilled brass locks designed to keep me out of my own kitchen, and the horrifying realization that he was actively shopping for the cheapest, most depressing nursing home bed he could find. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with absolute, unwavering hesitation. With that single stroke of ink, the grand, luxurious estate instantly ceased to be a home. It immediately became a purely industrial asset, destined for complete annihilation. Slater happily countersigned the thick stack of documents and confidently pushed the massive cashier's check across the table to me. My heavy demolition crews are already actively staging their massive bulldozers and excavators exactly 3 blocks away. As soon as the county sheriff officially clears the building of all occupants, we start swinging the heavy steel wrecking balls. No delays. Solomon calmly dialed a specific direct number on his desk phone and put it on loudspeaker. County Sheriff's Emergency Dispatch. This is Attorney David Solomon, formally representing the new corporate owners of 1242 Lakeview Drive. We currently possess a fully signed writ of immediate possession and an emergency, court-ordered vacate order pending immediate structural demolition. We urgently require a heavy civil standby for the physical removal of aggressive, hostile squatters. Roger that, Mr. Solomon, the gruff dispatcher said over the static. We can easily be at that location in approximately 20 minutes. Are the current occupants known to be violent or hostile? They absolutely will be. I leaned in close to the microphone and stated firmly. Dispatch, copy that. We are sending 2 heavily armed units right now. Solomon reached out and hung up the phone. The massive international wire transfer for the remaining business accounts has fully cleared the federal system. The commercial bank has officially called the massive loan on Brandon's failing company. His corporate accounts and his personal checking accounts are completely, irreversibly frozen. Every single one of his platinum credit cards is entirely dead. He is currently standing somewhere, angrily swiping completely useless pieces of plastic, wondering why his world is ending. And the IRS documents, I asked, my tone completely clinical. The thick packet was personally hand-delivered by our best courier. The elite federal forensic accounting team has everything they need. The invisible clock is rapidly ticking down on his remaining freedom. I stood up slowly, carefully folding the heavy, life-changing check and securing it deep in the breast pocket of my suit. Thank you for everything, Solomon. You have done excellent work today. You fully understand there is absolutely no going back from this point. Clint, he warned one last time, his eyes searching mine for any sign of regret. We are going to aggressively strip the valuable copper wire, completely crush the concrete foundation into dust, and fill the expensive swimming pool with useless, broken rubble. Make it an incredibly deep hole, I said, turning away. Bury absolutely everything. I left the quiet, insulated law firm, exiting through the revolving doors into the loud, bright, chaotic city. I was now in permanent exile, no longer part of a warm, forgiving world where fathers unconditionally loved their sons. I raised my hand and hailed a passing yellow cab. "Where to, sir?" the tired driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. 1242 Lakeview Drive. Step on it. I have a highly anticipated date with a heavy bulldozer. During the fast, bumpy drive, my cheap burner phone buzzed rapidly. I still had complete, unrestricted backdoor access to all of Brandon's personal email accounts, simply because he was too incredibly lazy and arrogant to ever change his secondary recovery passwords. Alert, transaction declined, Starbucks 6:45. I smiled. It was starting, he was broke, though he probably thought it was a simple bank glitch. The memory of his entitlement tasted like ash in my mouth. I remembered the blistering summers I spent roofing houses in the unforgiving Texas heat, my hands cracked and bleeding, building the capital that he now flushed down the drain of his own vanity. I built my empire with calloused hands and a spine of steel. I taught him the value of $1, but he only learned the price of a given luxury. He had taken the safety net I wove from my own sweat and treated it like a permanent hammock. Today, I was taking a razor blade to the ropes. The sheer arrogance of assuming the world would endlessly cater to his whims was a disease, and I was the cure. I watched the digital transaction records scroll on my phone, each red line a nail in the coffin of his unearned lifestyle. A cold, hard satisfaction settled in my chest, heavy and absolute like an iron anvil. Let him panic, let him feel the walls closing in. The reality of poverty is a harsh teacher, but it is the only one he has left. Alert. Transaction declined, Visa Platinum 6:45. He was finding out the well had run dry. He was about to come home to complain, only to find 2 armed deputies and a garbage dumpster in his living room. The cab turned onto Lakeview Drive. In the distance, I saw flashing blue police lights and heavy yellow demolition machinery idling like metal beasts. The majestic brick house I built with my own hands looked permanent and safe, but it was a total lie. I paid the driver and stepped out, straightening my charcoal tie. I crossed the street. As the executioner, the deputies were cutting the chain Brandon had put up to keep me out. The irony was poetic. I waited on the sidewalk. I wanted him to see the new suit, the clear eyes, and the man he had spit on returning to wipe the slate clean. Soon, I heard the aggressive roar of his Porsche. He was racing toward a finish line that had already been moved. The neighborhood was a pristine canvas of generational wealth, lined with ancient oaks and manicured lawns that cost more to maintain than most men earned in a year. The air smelled of expensive blooming jasmine and damp, fresh-cut grass, an illusion of permanent serenity. But beneath the surface, it was built on hollow debt and fragile egos. The heavy diesel exhaust of the idling demolition machinery cut through the sweet floral scent, a harsh, violent warning of the storm to come. The massive yellow steel of the excavator looked like an alien monster parked against the pristine white curbs, its hydraulic arms leaking a single drop of black grease onto the polished concrete. The contrast was beautiful, a raw injection of blue-collar reality into a neighborhood built entirely on white-collar lies. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the cool autumn wind bite against my face. The crisp air sharpened my focus. Every stone I laid in that house was a testament to my love, and every stone I was about to crush was a testament to my self-respect. The scales of justice were finally balancing. 1 p.m. The main event was about to begin. From the shadow of an oak tree I planted 30 years ago, I had a perfect view of my son's spectacular funeral. Brandon screeched into the driveway, screaming into his Bluetooth earpiece, oblivious to the cut chain and the new reality. Within an hour, sleek black catering vans arrived, setting up elegant tables over the septic tank access. It was poetic, a feast on top of waste. Soon, matte black SUVs and low-slung sports cars arrived, carrying predators in bespoke suits. Among them was Tony Russo, who limped up the steps with a heavy cane, calculating his return on investment. He didn't know his paper contract was worthless. Vanessa stepped onto the terrace in a shimmering silver dress, holding champagne and laughing. She looked relieved, thinking the problem was solved, believing I was heavily medicated in a locked ward. Brandon moved frantically through the crowd, sweating and pleading. He was selling a dream that had already defaulted. checking his phone constantly for a confirmation call from the psychiatric ward that would never come. He took another large drink and grabbed a microphone near the pool. "Welcome, everyone," he shouted, voice cracking. "Today marks a new era for Vance Ventures. My father has officially decided to step down. Due to severe health reasons, he could not be here, but he sends his blessing." I clenched my fists. He was using my hard-earned name to buy time with dangerous sharks. I watched Tony Russo from the shadows, analyzing his every movement. The man was a predator in a tailored suit, but unlike my son, Russo understood the harsh mechanics of the world. He knew that debts were paid in blood or money, and he didn't care which. His dark, dead eyes scanned the crowd, mentally carving up the property, evaluating the art, the cars, the women. He was a shark circling a sinking ship, completely unaware that the ship had already been stripped of its cargo. The violent reality of the men Brandon had invited into our lives made my decision even easier. You don't negotiate with a rabid dog, you simply remove yourself from its path and let it starve. Brandon thought his polished vocabulary and fake confidence could control the criminal underworld, but he was merely a sheep playing dress-up in a den of hungry wolves. The bill for his arrogance was coming due, and I was making absolutely sure that I wouldn't be the one signing the check. "Let the wolves have him. To the money!" Russo shouted back a direct demand, not a toast. Brandon downed his glass, surveying his kingdom. He didn't see the sheriff's cruisers or the yellow excavator rumbling down the street. And he certainly didn't see me walking purposefully toward the iron gate. As I approached, the party's chatter died rapidly. Brandon followed the intense gaze of his guests and saw the armed deputies and Slater. Then he saw me. His eyes widened in unadulterated terror. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered. "Dad?" he mouthed. Vanessa dropped her hors d'oeuvre, seeing the ghost she thought she'd buried. Tony Russo smiled a terrifying smile, realizing the game was up, and backed away into the shadows. I stopped at the edge of the patio. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, smelling the absolute authority. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Brandon stammered. "You are sick." "I am not sick, Brandon," my voice carried powerfully. "And I am definitely not retired." I pulled out the legal eviction notice. "I am the landlord, and your lease has officially expired." The deputies stepped forward. "Brandon Vance, we have a court order for the immediate vacation of these premises. This property has been legally sold for immediate demolition." "You have 10 minutes sold?" Brandon screamed. "You cannot possibly sell it." "It is my house." I stepped closer so only he could hear. "It was never your house, son. You were a bad squatter who forgot to pay the rent of respect." I signaled Slater. The excavator revved, shooting thick black smoke into the air as the heavy steel bucket lifted. The demolition had begun, and the first thing to crumble was my son's ego. The mechanical beast roared with a terrifying, primal intensity, the heavy diesel engine drowning out the pathetic jazz music that had been floating over the terrace. Thick, choking black smoke billowed from the exhaust stack, painting the clear blue sky with a violent streak of industrial gray. The massive steel tracks chewed aggressively into the pristine, emerald-green lawn, tearing up imported sod and leaving deep, muddy scars in the earth. The hydraulic pistons hissed like massive, angry serpents as the heavy steel bucket curled backward, preparing for the strike. The sheer power of the machine was intoxicating, a physical manifestation of my own restrained anger, finally let off the leash. I saw the absolute terror in the eyes of the wealthy guests as they realized this wasn't a show. This wasn't a stunt. This was raw, unfiltered destruction brought directly to their doorstep. The ground shook violently under their expensive shoes, shattering their fragile illusion of safety. They scrambled backward, knocking over crystal champagne glasses and elegant tables, desperately trying to escape the blast radius of a wrath they could not comprehend. The roar of the diesel engine drowned out the party music. The ground shook. Wealthy guests scattered in confusion and fear, abandoning their curated exclusivity for the brutal reality of a construction site. Brandon stood frozen. I walked past him to the excavator. Slater handed me my old scratched hard hat from the carriage house. I placed it on my head, transforming back into the job site supervisor. I signaled to cut the engine, and the sudden silence was heavy. All eyes were on me. "Get down from there." Brandon screamed, "You are crazy." "This is my property," the lead deputy calmly replied. "According to the legal paperwork, this is not your property." "He is senile. I have the deed in the ironclad trust." Brandon yelled. "Let's talk about the trust," I boomed over the yard. The guests leaned in, understanding that when police stand down for a demolition crew, the ledger is catastrophic. "You never read the documents, did you? You signed Land Trust Agreement number 8492. But you forgot Article 7. The power of direction. The trust holds the title, but I hold the trust. You were an unwanted tenant, with a $0 lease requiring a standard of conduct." He shrieked. "I am the CEO. You ran up debts, and last night you spit on the landlord." I touched my cheek. "That is a breach of contract." The crowd gasped. Vanessa froze, realizing she had bet on the wrong horse. "You cannot do this. My wife legally lives here." "My things are in there. I revoked your beneficial interest at 6 a.m. At 9 a.m. I sold the land to Tri-State Waste Management. They consider the house an obstruction." Brandon's ego fought the horrifying reality. "You sold my inheritance. Inheritance is a gift, not a right. You do not give gifts to people who treat you like garbage." So I sold it to the garbage men. The wealthy guests began fleeing toward their cars, not wanting to be around when the violent bill came due. Brandon desperately tried to win the crowd back. "He has severe dementia. I have the power of attorney." I held up the medical affidavit. "I am not sick, and I am not broke. My son lied to you all. There is no capital. The bank accounts are frozen. The credit cards are dead, and the IRS has the books. This house is about to be a pile of cheap bricks." Vanessa screamed, pummeling Brandon's chest. "You idiot! You promised me he was gone." "He lied to you too, Vanessa," I said. "But you wanted the cheapest nursing home bed and heavy restraints. Grab whatever you can carry. In 5 minutes, this excavator is going through the front door." The deputies cleared the area. The beautiful people scrambled away, leaving Brandon alone in the driveway. He looked small. "Dad, please, where will we go?" "Maybe that nursing home you picked out for me," I said coldly. I turned to the operator. "Fire it up." The engine roared. The bucket curled. "Wait." "My watch! My collection!" Brandon screamed, crawling backward. Slater blew a whistle. "Demolition in 3, 2, 1. The machine swung, smashing the brick pillar of the front gate. Iron twisted, brick exploded. It was the first blow of destruction. "Get him off the property," I shouted. 2 deputies dragged the kicking, screaming Brandon to the street. He was now a trespasser. I watched Vanessa run out, clutching a Louis Vuitton bag and a jewelry box, screaming as dust rolled over her. I felt no regret. I was unmaking my mistake and reclaiming my life. I watched her stumble in her expensive high heels, the delicate straps snapping under the sudden, brutal pressure of the uneven terrain. The dust coated her shimmering silver dress, turning it into a dull, tragic gray. She looked like a ghost wandering through the ruins of a forgotten empire, desperately clutching the tiny, meaningless trinkets she valued more than her own dignity. The Louis Vuitton bag, bought with my money, swung wildly from her arm as she sobbed. It was a pathetic, empty display of shallow materialism, crashing headfirst into the immovable wall of reality. For years, she had looked down on me, whispering cruel jokes to Brandon about my calloused hands and simple tastes. She had mocked the very foundation she stood upon, completely blind to the fact that without my money, she was nothing more than a pretty, hollow shell. Now, the shell was cracked, and the emptiness inside was spilling out onto the dirty pavement for everyone to see. The jewelry box slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the ground and popping open. Brilliant diamonds and thick gold chains spilled into the thick, choking dust, glittering uselessly amidst the broken bricks and shattered glass. She didn't even stop to pick them up, the raw, primal fear of the massive yellow machine driving her forward. Her panicked screams faded into the mechanical roar of the excavator as it swung its heavy arm again. I turned my gaze away from her fleeing form, feeling a profound, absolute emptiness where my sympathy should have been. The slate was being wiped clean, and she was merely dust on the chalkboard, blown away by the cold wind of consequence. Every decision they made had led them precisely to this exact moment, standing helpless in the ruins of their own making. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the sharp, biting scent of pulverized mortar and diesel fuel. It was the distinct smell of progress, the undeniable scent of a necessary violent cleansing. The past was dying right in front of me, crushed under 30 tons of unforgiving steel, and I was finally truly free. The sheer beauty of the destruction was captivating. Each shattered window and crumbling wall represented a severed chain that had kept me completely bound to their toxic, parasitic existence for far too long. I stood tall, watching my expensive mistake fall. "Take the roof off," I commanded. Vanessa stood at the police line, shrieking for her closet, "My bags. My pearls, let me go back in." "It is debris now, ma'am," the deputy pushed her back. "Anything inside is considered hazardous waste. Hazardous waste, bought with dirty money and stolen retirement funds." Brandon sat on the curb, covered in tears and dust. He looked past the police line to the street. The matte black SUVs were still there, facing the house like a funeral procession. Tony Russo leaned against his car, cleaning his fingernails with a knife, staring directly at Brandon. Brandon's face drained of color. He realized the armed deputies weren't his biggest problem. The police have rules, loan sharks have a ledger, and he was in the red. He was trapped between the law, his father, and the criminals. I pointed at the portico's limestone columns. "Bring it down." The excavator's boom reached out and snapped the first column like a gunshot. The roof sagged, the second column buckled, and the structure collapsed in a cloud of white dust, blocking the door forever. Vanessa fell to her knees. "My life is in there!" She wailed. "No, Vanessa," I thought. "Your things are in there. Your life is on the dirty pavement, and it is entirely empty." More machines rolled off flatbeds. Slater ordered his crew. "Strip the copper, then flatten it. Crush the foundation by 6. I climbed down and walked past the filming neighbors to where Brandon and Vanessa huddled like ruined refugees. They looked up at me with pure fear. "Dad, please," Brandon whispered. "The Russos, they are going to kill me." I glanced at Tony Russo, who tipped his head in cold acknowledgement. "You borrowed the money, Brandon. That is between you and your violent business partners. I do not have a single dime." "You froze the accounts," he cried, grabbing my jacket. I pulled free, meticulously brushing the spot he touched. "Then start looking for a job picking up trash on the highway. It pays minimum wage, but it is honest work." Vanessa stood up, her eyes hard. "You old bastard. His blood will be on your hands. His blood is his own. And as for you, Vanessa, when the IRS audits those credit cards, you are going to wish the Russos were looking for you." She blanched, realizing Brandon was a sinking ship. "I am leaving," she said. "Where?" Brandon asked. "Away from you. You are broke, in debt to the mob, and useless to me." She walked away without looking back. Brandon watched his wife abandon him. "I have nothing," he whispered. "You have what you earned, son," I said. I turned my back, walking to the sheriff's cruiser for a ride to the airport. My work was done, the vermin scattered, the ground cleared. At O'Hare International, the ticket agent asked, "Where to?" "Rome, Italy. One way, first class." I had wanted to go there for 20 years but was too busy paying for Brandon's mistakes. I tossed my burner phone battery in the trash. The line was dead. On the plane, drinking dark Barolo wine, I looked down at Chicago. Somewhere down there, my former son was realizing winter had finally come. We pour our sweat into foundations believing sacrifice is love. But a foundation built on disrespect will always crumble. Sometimes, the most loving thing a father can do is stop shielding his son from consequences. My dignity has a price tag, and it is not negotiable. The jet engines roared to life, pressing me firmly back into the plush leather seat as the massive aircraft accelerated down the runway. Through the thick glass of the window, I watched the sprawling, intricate grid of Chicago slowly shrink into a glowing patchwork of tiny, insignificant lights. Somewhere down there in the freezing urban sprawl, Brandon was finally learning the true, inescapable weight of the real world. The cold reality of his empty pockets would be a far harsher judge than I ever could be. I took a slow sip of the dark, heavy Barolo wine, letting the complex, oaky flavors linger on my tongue. It tasted like freedom. For decades, I had carried the immense, crushing burden of his endless failures on my weary shoulders, mistaking my infinite patience for fatherly love. I had built a fortress to protect him, only to realize I was simply funding his prison of entitlement. The realization brought a profound, silent peace to my hardened soul. The sky above the clouds was a vast, unbroken expanse of endless stars, a blank slate stretching out into the infinite darkness. I closed my eyes, letting the steady, rhythmic hum of the plane's engines wash over me, carrying me toward a new, unwritten chapter in Rome. The ledger was finally, permanently balanced. The debts were entirely paid. The infected slate was wiped totally clean. And for the very first time in my long, exhausting life, I owed absolutely nothing to anyone. The cold wind howled outside the thick cabin walls, but inside I was perfectly peacefully warm.